All right, let's get into it. Today, we're going to pull apart a really interesting commentary video that went viral. It analyzes this superheated interview between CNBC and Representative Hakeem Jeffries. Now, just to be clear, our job here isn't to decide who's right or wrong. What we really want to understand is how the commentator set up this debate for his audience. So right out of the gate, the commentator throws this quote up. He says, CNBC is business news, and people make financial decisions based on reality, not wishful thinking. This single sentence, it basically sets the stage for his entire argument. He's drawing a line in the sand between what he calls reality and, well, narrative spinning. And that's the key, right? The commentator isn't just showing an interview, he's framing it as a brutal fact check. He's not presenting it as a debate between two equal sides. So we're going to dig in and see exactly how he builds that case, looking at the key arguments he chose to highlight. And here it is, the core premise of the whole video. The commentator's argument is that the CNBC host just completely dismantled the representative's points, refuting every, and I'm quoting here, lie, misleading statement, and talking point with irrefutable evidence. So everything we're about to see is filtered through that specific lens, facts versus narrative. All right, let's get into the specifics. The first major battleground that the commentator breaks down is this fundamental disagreement over the health of the U.S. economy. Pretty big topic, right?
So here's how the fight starts. You've got Representative Jeffries on one side, making this pretty stark claim that the economy is in shambles. But then the CNBC host immediately pushes back. He's not using feelings. He's pointing to Wall Street metrics that, in his view, suggest things are actually going pretty well.
And he brings receipts. The host pulls up data, charts like this one, showing that major stock indices, the S&P, the NASDAQ, were hitting or were really close to all-time highs. His point is pretty simple. You just don't see that kind of market performance if the economy is about to fall off a cliff. But he wasn't done. It wasn't just about the stock market. He then points to the bond market, which, is usually seen as the more sober, cautious cousin to the stock market, and he says, look, there's no panic or angst there either. The alarm bells that would signal a real crisis just aren't ringing.
Okay, so how does Representative Jeffries respond to all this data? Well, he pivots. He basically sidesteps the broad market numbers and instead brings in anecdotal evidence. He says, well, actually, I talk to corporate leaders all the time, and they're worried. He's shifting the debate from hard data to personal testimony. And this is where the commentator really zeroes in on what he sees as a major contradiction. He shows how the representative first says corporate leaders are incredibly concerned, but then, later on, seems to admit that, quote, the investor class is doing well. The commentator presents this as a gotcha moment. All right, next up, the debate moves from the overall economy to a really specific and contentious piece of policy, a major tax bill. And the question here is a classic one. Who did this thing really help? Was it a boost for everyday people or just a handout to the rich? So the host jumps in to argue that this bill wasn't just for billionaires. He actually breaks it down into a few key points he says helped working-class folks directly. He's talking about things like potentially higher tax refunds, getting rid of taxes on tips, which would mean more take-home pay, and no tax on overtime. He's trying to show tangible benefits. And then, to make it even more concrete, the host uses a real-world example. He plays this quote from the CFO of Johnson & Johnson. The CFO is basically saying, look, at the old 35% tax rate, it made no sense to invest in the U.S. It would have been a dereliction of duty. But now, he says, the game is equal.
And the host doesn't just leave it at the quote, he throws out this number, $55 billion. That's the size of the investment plan Johnson & Johnson apparently launched in the U.S. after that tax rate change. The number is there to make a point. This policy shift had huge, tangible consequences. So how does the representative counter this? He pivots again. He kind of brushes aside the corporate investment numbers and says, the real question, the fundamental question, is whether life has gotten better for everyday Americans. He argues it hasn't, and he starts listing off rising costs. Housing, utilities, healthcare, childcare, gas, you name it. He's changing the metric of success from corporate investment to household budgets.
And then, the conversation takes a complete 180. This is the last big clash the commentator focuses on. We leave economics completely behind and dive headfirst into foreign policy, and specifically, the administration's stance on Iran. Now, Representative Jeffries doesn't mince words on this one. He makes this incredibly strong claim, saying the administration presented, and I quote, zero evidence of any imminent threat from Iran that would justify the actions the U.S. took.
And the second he makes that zero evidence claim, the commentator pounces. He puts it right next to a counterpoint from a 60 Minutes report, and he's quick to point out that 60 Minutes isn't exactly a pro-Trump outlet. The report said Iran had enough nuclear material for 10 or 11 bombs. So he's framing this as a direct factual takedown of the zero evidence statement. Okay, so after walking us through all these specific back and forths, the commentator zooms out. He uses this entire interview as a sort of case study to make his final, much bigger point about the state of modern politics.
And this is really his grand thesis. He argues that modern politics has just become sensationalized, that politicians are forced to appeal to voters' emotions instead of their reason. He says tribalism, rooting for your team, means you have to pretend real threats are no big deal just to make the other side look bad. And it all leads to this divided media landscape, where you have reality on one side and narrative spinning on the other.
And he wraps it all up with this one line that perfectly captures his whole point. Stats, facts, reality, and truth all tell a different story. He's coming full circle, hammering home that initial idea that one side has the facts and the other is just telling the story.
So what are we left with? Here's the big question to think about. Forget for a second who you think won the debate. The real question is this. When any commentator from any side frames a debate as a simple fight between narrative and facts, how does that automatically shape our understanding before we even get to the substance? It's an incredibly powerful way to frame an argument, and just being aware of it is crucial for anyone trying to make sense of the world today. Thanks for joining me.